3. Hallam always wakes up to Verity's footsteps. With shoes on, her short, measured gait ticked like a metronome past his bedroom door and down the corridor at the end, signaling the start of the day. Sometimes he would jerk awake to what he thought was her ticking heels to find he had been fooled by the bedside clock, which showed the time to 3 in the morning. Even then he would lie awake and strain his ears, listening to the fading echo of what was not there, but Verity's footsteps went further back. He had the impression that he knew them even before he knew her, and childish dreams made distressing by their formlessness. They were not steps then, but the sensation was the same. It might be the surrounding noise that grew to an almost unbearable volume before fading again. Or once, he recalled, the color red absorbing the grayness of a space without context, inducing panic as it threatened to engulf him. Verity had always controlled his dreams. Hallam's eyes opened to the shuttered dark, but soon the shapes of furniture asserted themselves. The steps, it seemed, had stopped. Then the door opened and Hallam saw Verity standing in the morning glare. It exposed the grub-like shape of his legs under the duvet. He wriggled up to a sitting position and squinted, shielding his eyes. "Hallam, I think your father has some chores for you to do today." She left the door open and headed downstairs without waiting for a reply. The briskness was not unusual. Verity rarely bothered with the formalities of good morning and good night. It was as if she knew she never left him. He sank back down under the duvet. He put his hands behind his head and thought back to the night before, which, with birdsong outside, seemed to have acquired the status of paranoid fantasy. Perhaps his conversation with Verity on the drive was not what he thought it had been, namely, a declaration of enmity containing a threat. Perhaps it had simply been a frank emotional discussion between adults, the sort that he would have to get used to now that he was a man. For Hallam, he was sure that at some point yesterday he had been initiated into manhood. It could have been about the time that he was punched in the face, or he smoked a pot, or made that daringly rude comment about his stepmother. He considered consulting Lucy on the subject, but it did not seem right. Indeed, it did not seem manly, especially now that she was leaving. Nor could he think of a good reason why Lucy's advice should carry any special weight after her botched attempt to outflank Verity. Hallam realized that he would have to rely on his own judgment in deciphering Verity's motives and intent. It felt like a very adult resolution to make, even if his hand had been forced. Hallam was emerging from his room and buckling up his jeans when Lucy hissed at him from her own bedroom doorway. "Morning," she said, and then checked both ways before whispering theatrically, "Almost out of here." Hallam smiled. "How does it feel?" "Bloody marvelous." He peered into her room and saw that her suitcases were almost packed. The personal decorations and accumulated knickknacks that had been bedecked her room were now dumped in the bin. It seemed that she had rooted out everything in her life that was superfluous. Hallam wondered if that included him. "To find the bag. You'll be gone soon." Lucy did a passable imitation of a hunchbacked crony with a hobble back to her packing. Hallam carried on downstairs and showed his face in the kitchen, where Julius was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, shirt untucked, not yet shaved. He saw Hallam and stood up. "Morning," he said cheerfully. Then he spotted his wife as she passed by behind Hallam. On her way to join Carl outside, he coughed gruffly and adopted a sterner attitude. "Come into the office, would you?" Hallam followed his father along the corridor, past the study, and into the orangery, where Julius and his staff of 2, sometimes 3, worked amid drapes of vines and pot plants. Computer screens and drawing boards were positioned around the circular glass house facing out. A semicircular shade shifted imperceptibly above them with the passage of sun to protect the terminals from glare. Julius's secretary, Nicola, perched nearby, the new cactus handling security behind her. She smiled neatly at Hallam, carried on tapping at her keyboard. Julius picked up some notes from his desk, which were most likely a product of the early morning conference he usually had with Verity while he took tea in bed. Hallam could see it. They were fastidiously laid out in Julius's imitation Renee McIntosh handwriting. In appearance, Julius was sloppy and neglectful, but there were compartments in his life, work and written presentation, that were ruled by unbending codes of discipline. Julius held the page out to Hallam, then changed his mind and passed it to his secretary. Actually, Nicola, could you tidy this up and get a printout? Certainly, Julius. Nicola gave the list a curt inspection and started to type with controlled fury, her little smile unmoving. Hallam looked her over. She had short red hair, a delicate complexion, and a sexless sense of order, but she was still fairly young. He wondered how long she would last now that Verity had acquired voting rights. "Have her read and tell me if you have any questions," said Julius. "Right," said Hallam. The phone began to ring. Nicola picked up the receiver and lodged it between shoulder and ear, and she continued to type, although the downpour of keystrokes abated to a shower. "The Foe partnership, how may I help?" Julius was already distracted. Nicola looked up, one finger on the phone's secrecy button. "It's John Hammersmith from the Surveyors." "Oh, right, I'd better get that." Nicola transferred to the call. Julius gratefully dashed to his terminal and started talking into his phone. Hallam stared up at the shade and, as usual, failed to detect its incremental progress. Nicola hit a key. The printer started up and floated a piece of A4 down into the tray. Nicola turned in her chair and handed it over to Hallam with a smile. "There you go, Hallam." "Thank you, Nicola." Nicola returned to her original task, and Hallam looked down at the piece of paper headed Hallam Foe Punishment Duty. "I wasn't terribly surprised by the remark you made yesterday evening, and I think it's time you pulled your weight a bit more around here, so you could help us in the following ways. Dredge the lake and make an assessment of its viability, with special reference to blanket weed problem and flow of water. Ask Carl for tools. Assist Carl in planting rhododendron bushes and other landscaping tasks. Brush cellar steps and tidy route to wine cellar. This should help to form your character and usefully contribute to the Foe premises. Any feedback can be made in the usual way. Best of luck, Julius Foe," signed in his absence by his PA. Verity had put him up to it surely. Hallam looked over at Julius, but he was now immersed in his conversation, bringing up various architectural plans on his screen. Hallam smiled to himself, rather proud of his ease with which these adult judgments were flowing, and headed for the back door, following the instructions as he went. He climbed the concrete steps toward the red brick stables and unlocked the tall black doors, whose floor bolts scraped along an ancient groove in the cobbles. He stepped inside, savoring the cool darkness and the whiff of engine oil mingled with sweet grass cuttings. The mini-tractor was parked there, surrounded by stacks of his mother's old furniture and other junk. Hallam looked up at the wooden planked roof, above which a loft ran the length of the stables. In the gloomy silence set apart from the world outside, he imagined being watched from up there. There were gaps in the planks, and a specially drilled spy hole that had already seen its most fruitful days. Hallam often entertained the notion that some part of his was forever patrolling the listening posts and observation points, in his absence maintaining the watch while he performed the drudgery of life on the ground. It was an idea that lulled him. Until he heard a noise from the loft, Hallam was jolted by the piercing fear that his fantasy might have taken shape. He froze and listened to the beating of his heart. He told himself to think of more sensible possibilities. A rat? There was another noise, a scuffle, this time for certain. Hallam grabbed a pitchfork. It seemed like the appropriate thing to do, and ran out of the stable toward the end of the block. He shoved open an unblocked door and raced up the wooden steps to the loft, not allowing himself the coward's option of giving the intruder an escape route. He had not even reached the top before he was a panicked clattering of wings, and a white dove rose up in front of his face, bisecting the floor with a thin line of black and white crap. The dove settled on a rafter, its white fantail upright and twitching. One eye blinked. Hallam panted with mingled relief and anticlimax. Then he reproved himself for being so jumpy and turned back to the steps with a last sneer at the bird. He hated doves, the way they flounced among the trees with the wildness bred out of them. The dovecotes had been Verity's idea, naturally. Hallam maneuvered the trailer by the side of the lake, turned off the tractor engine, and waited for the natural sounds to return. He looked longingly up at the dark smudge of the center point, and thought of the smell of the dry wood that would be in there now as the morning sun warmed it up, but there was no escape for him today. He went back to the trailer and banged down the flap. He took out a pair of shears, rusty and newly sharpened, then squatted by the lake edge. Dragonflies chinked across the surface as if it were wire-guided. He put one foot into the water, and coolness gripped his ankle, then flooded into his trainers and between his toes. He lowered himself in with a gasp. His toes found the slippery roots on the bottom, and the water level was up to his ribs, bracing him like a corset. He familiarized himself with the cold, then gingerly turned to face the bank. Wisps of disturbed mud rose from the bottom and spread against the water's surface. He thought of smoke against a window pane. The problem, Hallam knew, was that a huge interlacing blanket weed was clogging the lake, depriving any remaining fish of oxygen and causing the water to stagnate. The underground sluice that fed the two smaller ponds further down was little more than trickle now, and it was barely audible where once standing on the turf above it the rumble of shifting gullies could be felt through the feet. The real task, he surmised, was to demonstrate the futility of clearing the lake by hand and thereby convince Julius and Verity to buy the expensive poisons that would do the job properly. Hallam grabbed a handful of weed and plunged the leaves beneath the water. His ear dabbed the water as he sawed. 2 hours later, with the sun higher in the sky, his face and clothes were stained with muddy brown water, and the trailer was draped with stinking green dreadlocks. He had a long strand on the thickness of rope in his fists. He tugged, but it held firm. He wiped his brow, the cool water dripping down his face and off his lip. Then, looking closer, he relaxed. It was really a rope. Furtively, he glanced behind him. On unsteady footing, he followed the rope until he was up to his chest in the center of the lake. Then he twisted over his shoulder and dragged. Something there tore. He staggered and turned. What slowly broke the surface was just recognizable as the prow of a rowboat under a thick net of weed. He only saw it for a second before he slipped and the boat was sucked back down. Hallam sat on the jetty at the head of the lake. The smell of the half-stagnant water rose off him and the dappled shadows. He listened to the wind forcing its way through the trees and glanced over the bushes at the lake's end toward the church stump. It was late in the night when she woke him up. He could only have been 12 at the time. It was the middle of the night, and he could smell her perfume as she gently shook his shoulder, told him to get up and come outside. It took the promise of a special surprise to rouse him properly. His mother dressed him and took him by the hand out of the hall. He remembered the shock of the cold night air and the echoes of their breath as they made their way through the passage between the stables and the cottage. The grass around the lake was shorter then, and Hallam could hear the gurgling of the water from the sluices to his right as they approached the head of the lake. She had told him to take extra care while going down the ramp onto the jetty. It was only then that she informed him of her intention. They were going to undertake a lunar expedition. As she untied the bobbing rowboat, Hallam looked up at the clear night sky and saw the moon, almost full, high above. He thought she was being somewhat overambitious and told her so, but she would not listen. He asked tactfully whether they should wake up Dad so he could come along. She told him that it was too late now. His mother rowed them out a few feet onto the lake, by which time he realized what she meant. He saw the moon close up, a huge flashlight trembling on the surface of the water. As they approached, it began to wave signals. She laughed and slowed the boat with one oar, and they bobbed around the moon's quivering perimeter. She informed him that the Eagle had landed. Hallam reached out a hand and put it in the water and reported that contrary to scientists' claims, the moon was wet. She asked him to sprinkle some of the moon water on his face and hers, telling him that it would keep him young. She told him that he didn't want to get old. He remarked that he wouldn't mind turning 17 so that he could drive. He remembered that she smiled and touched his hair. That was when Julius appeared at the side of the lake, unmistakable despite the dark, outraged in his dressing gown. He shouted at Anne to come back to shore. Anne asked him for one good reason. He berated her for getting Hallam up in the middle of the night. The next day, after a night of wild argument and weeping, Anne was back in the hospital. That was when Julius had first spoken out loud the name of Hallam's mother's illness. Hallam heard Carl's loud, chirruping call, and replied by arranging his fingers in his mouth, and emitting a bird-like remorse of his own. A few seconds later, Carl appeared at the top of the ramp. "There you are." He bounced down the ramp and sat down next to Hallam. Hallam flicked a black bug the side of a pinhead off his slightly steaming jeans. "You smell like crap," said Carl and grimaced. Hallam smiled, relieved that he had been forgiven. "Why, thank you." They both sat back and looked over the lake, enjoying the reconfirmation of their friendship. "There's some surveyors arrived at the hall," said Carl eventually. "They're heading up this way." "Surveying for what?" "Search me." Carl rubbed some dried mud off his hands. Hallam admired his strong fingers with their brown, cracked nails. "I'd better look as if I'm doing some work then," said Hallam. "Verity says you're up to help me with the hedge. Didn't you just put it in?" "It hasn't grown fast enough, according to her. She wants us to tear it out and put in bigger plants." Hallam knew this would upset Carl. Carl hated Verity's impatience with nature almost as much as her interference, although he never said a word against her despite constant encouragement and occasional teasing. What's it like in there, then? Asked Carl, indicating the water. Pretty hopeless, said Hallam. I'll try and convince Julius that it needs to be fixed properly. I think the sides are collapsing. Carl nodded. They both knew the prospect of repairs was very dim. Over the years, Carl had constantly lobbied Julius for plantings that would take 20 or 30 years to start bearing fruit, for investments that would guard against problems 50 or 100 years further down the line. Most of them Julius politely but firmly ignored, and Carl would gracefully withdraw for another couple of months until a sense of duty brought him back to Dora once more. Hallam shared Carl's loyalty to the lakes, the trees, the life within them. There was something sedimentary and precious here that had to be defended and preserved, all the more because it was less definable than pretty frets about budgets and pest control. How could the spirit of nature and man, so rarely and harmoniously combined, be weighed against dredging costs? Hallam, said Carl, why do you spend all your time up in their tree houses? Hallam didn't know what to say. Ever since your mother died, you've hardly come down. Carl never asked questions like that. Hallam moved his trainers on the wooden slacks of the jetty. You watch people, don't you? Carl persisted. Hallam was desperately trying to think a way out of this. He could say bird watching, but it was too transparent a lie to give Carl, especially after the incident with Ginny. So he shrugged and nodded vaguely. Yeah, sometimes. Why? That's such a stupid question. Why? Why not? Because it's not. Carl struggled for the appropriate word. Polite? I can't explain. It's to do with your mother, isn't it? Look, Carl, I'm sorry for what I did. I won't do it again, but it's none of your business. Carl sat up, offended but resigned. Then he stood up and looked away. I'll be down along the drive. See you in a bit, said Hallam. I'll do some more here for form's sake. Carl went up the ramp, his big, firm footsteps causing the place to judder. Hallam watched him go with regret, then returned his gaze to the surface of the lake. Hallam knew why he went up to the treehouse in the first place. That was simple enough. To escape from the useless grief of relatives, unfamiliar ones, mostly, who mooed sadly about the past and stayed the night, who called up to express their most unctuous sympathies, who popped over with cakes and delicate phrasing, who pitied. Soon the treehouse became a refuge. An uncle, thinking the lad might be interested in ornithology, bought him a book on the subject, together with an old telescope, and Hallam took them with him up the tree. More to allay the worried looks on that occasion were sent his way. He only wanted to be left alone. The rest were more complicated, although there was one deceptively small incident that over the years had acquired talismanic significance in his mind that he himself had never fully addressed until now. It was in the green dampness of early summer, a world thriving, it seemed, on his mother's self-sacrifice, that he had looked down and seen in the adjoining fields the neighboring farmer, Mr. Shaney, creeping stealthily along the hedgerow with a shotgun. Hallam had watched him idly at first, and then the farmer had frozen and remained absolutely still, apparently listening. Presumably he was on the lookout for crows or other vermin. Hallam had experienced the sharp, childish pleasure of not being seen for what was perhaps just a few seconds. And then the farmer moved on into the adjoining field, but a mysterious fascination had been activated. Somehow a perfectly everyday rural procedure had been turned into a private, unrepeatable piece of theater. One moment of tense silence, unknowingly shared between watcher and subject, was enough to make Hallam want more. For years now, firmly believed that he had been born with a predisposition for observation. It was a matter of the soul that could not be explained away by Carl's clumsy Freudian connection-making. It had only been a periscope view of salvation at first, made fraught by terror of discovery, but with practice Hallam had gained in confidence and gradually learnt the principles and disciplines of observation. Here was true escape. Not withdrawal from the world, but entry into a new one. He had discovered what his kind of voyeurism could be. Not a lonely vice, the common perception, but a passionate engagement with the lives of others, and a passionate detachment from his own, of course. He became fascinated enough by the things he saw to want to record them. He plotted out and named this new world in his logbooks, feeling like a pioneering anthropologist. There was self-abnegation in the being, in the long hours of discomfort and boredom, and as he crawled through the dripping hedgerows, or crouched immobile behind the gravestones with his throbbing, bloodless feet, he knew that he was learning more than physical resilience. It was returning his curiosity to the world. When he felt deadened to it, it was providing him with a secret existence. Most importantly, it brought him solace, although he did not understand why exactly. He did not want to know why. The farmer with his gun, he was protecting his land and beasts the simple way, with direct action. There was something noble about that, Hallam concluded. There was something to be learned. Hallam was back in the lake when Julian arrived with 2 men in their suits and Wellingtons. Their conversation was muttered, and from his position it was difficult to hear. They stopped within view, and Julius pointed up at the oak tree at Center Point. Then they checked the plans that Julius had with him. That was when Julius spotted Hallam, who had been forced to swat at insects that were attempting to gain entry to his nostrils. "Hallam, could you go up and help Carl down the front?" Hallam wadded slowly to the lake edge, hoping the men would continue their conversation, but they did not. They smiled at him instead as he climbed dripping from the water. "You're doing a fine job, lad," said one of them. "Just don't come near me." Yo-ho-ho, the 3 of them went, and the gruff jocularity of men on sight. Hallam trudged away, strangely depressed by the poor joke. His trainer squelched comically as it made him even more disconsolate. The men waited until he was out of earshot before they went back to their plans. Hallam was struggling to suppress a sense of impending catastrophe as he walked down beyond the stables, at which point he glimpsed Verity and Lucy walking around the front of the hall, deep in conversation. "It's not that I don't love him," Verity was saying. "God knows this sex was amazing. He seems incapable of controlling his feelings. It scares me sometimes." And then they were gone round the corner. Hallam was momentarily, and by his own standards, unprofessionally stunned, but within a few seconds he was dashing around the other side of the hall, pounding down the back of the walled garden, and skirting the drooping branches of the Wellington. Leaping over the gravel path so he couldn't be heard, he reached the cover of thick bushes just as the 2 women hopped out to sight and turned down a path that weaved its way through some silver birches. Hallam reached his listening post and bade time to control his panting at Verity, and Lucy came to their customary bench, surrounded by a high-clipped edge. For the first time, Hallam was unable to achieve the objective concentration he had always found so useful as a spy. This was not because he was presumably about to find out about his father's sex life. Effing held no secrets for him anymore, and the repeated observation had all but extinguished any personal desire for first-hand experience. More exciting was the prospect of having access to the emotional life of his father, which hitherto had been little more than unsubstantiated rumor, unless you counted the beige spectre between Bluff and Grumpy. Hallam held his breath as they hovered a foot away from him. Verity was still talking. "You must have noticed his look yourself. All that possessiveness and hostility. How am I supposed to?" But then they moved on, down towards the front lawns proper, where they could only be overheard dimly from the southwest traverse, which was too exposed to comfort and difficult to reach without being spotted. Hallam watched despairingly as they lingered in the middle of the lawn. Then Lucy, in the midst of the conversation, lost her temper and shouted, "Why are you telling me all this?" She turned and strode back up the same path. Verity followed. "Because you understand," she replied soothingly, attempted to take Lucy's hand. "Because we're friends." They were perfectly in position by the bench when Lucy turned and pulled her hand away. The suggestion of friendship obviously disgusted her now. "I can't believe I let you into my life. I've always felt that we could trust each other. I started to believe that. It was my mistake." A pause. Hallam could not see their faces, and therefore denied access to their silent communication. "I wouldn't if I was you," said Verity. "I know what you're thinking." "What?" "You're thinking of telling Julius about Alex." "Lucy's friend, Alex?" thought Hallam. "Verity and Alex?" He felt rather let down. Infidelity no longer had the power to shock him, any more than the sexual act, or so he thought, although the way that Verity appeared to have made Lucy complicit in her affair was quite a development. "Can't you see the position you put me in?" Lucy replied, lowering her voice. "He's my father. You'll grow out of moralizing soon enough." Verity's voice had relaxed carefully. "It only makes you look stupid in the long run." "You were an early developer, I presume," said Lucy, attempting irony. "Perhaps I was wrong to confide in you," Verity said, her voice still conciliatorily. "But didn't you want to talk too? It was only because we felt more like sisters than—" "You were never going to be that. Your closeness is control, but who cares? I'm leaving now. Julius is happy, Lucy. Don't let me down." Lucy replied with a snort of derision. "Or is that the problem?" Lucy did not answer the question. Hallam still could not see her expression through the foliage. He shifted and found a fragment of view. "You won't be able to put him off, although you'll certainly hurt him." Lucy stepped closer. "Do you think I want him?" Hallam was confused. Who were they talking about now? People's trains of thought in private conversation could be a bewildering maze for the eavesdropper. Perhaps not, Verity sighed and smiled and looked away down the path. I wonder where Hallam is. He does worry me sometimes. Hallam? Asked Lucy blankly. Presumably you don't care about him either. He's not done anything to you, said Lucy, her tone colorless. I think it's time you went. A brief silence, and then Lucy's footsteps crunched quickly away. Verity stood there alone for so long that Hallam wondered whether she might have seen him, and was waiting for him to stand up and surrender. His knees shook violently, and he willed himself not to lose his balance or allow his trainers to squelch, or for her to smell the dankness coming off his clothes. Eventually Verity's footsteps followed Lucy's. They were slower, more measured. The digging made the main drive look as if it had been bombarded. Around 30 holes had appeared among the shrubs and trees, about 2 foot square and deep. You've been busy, remarked Hallam to Carl, who had a welly placed on the blade of his spade. His temples were shining with sweat. They both turned and saw Verity coming down the drive. We're going to have to shift that dirt into the trailer later on, said Carl. There's fertilizer coming, rhododendrons. I think the rose bed's due for the chop once we've done the hedge, from what I hear. She says it aggravates her pollen allergy. Verity joined them. She looked over at the house that backed into the drive. A neighbor was peering balefully out of a window. Good afternoon, Miss Hitchens, called Verity. Enjoy the view while it lasts. Miss Hitchens scowled and drew the curtains. Hallam had several entries in his logbook about her stealing through the gates after dusk to take cuttings from some more expensive shrubs that had been planted in the past few months. I can't hear that woman gulping into the grounds. It makes my skin crawl, said Verity. There is always someone watching what you do in this village. Then Verity noticed Hallam's wet clothes covered in green slime and bugs, and started chuckling. Oh, Hallam, she said indulgently. He belongs in a handkerchief, quipped Carl. She laughed and continued her stroll down the drive, inspecting the holes, plotting fresh devastation. By the way, Hallam, she called over her shoulder casually, come up to the house in an hour and we can all see Lucy off together. Once she was safe distance away, Hallam spat on the ground. B. Carl sighed and lifted his spade over his shoulder. She seems all right to me. Well, I expect she's up for it if you're interested. Carl looked horrified by Hallam's interpretation of his comment, but realizing that it was one of Hallam's less savory jokes, gritted his teeth in anger and embarrassment. He went over to the hedge. Hallam felt slightly guilty and followed him. Seems a shame to rip them out half-grown, Hallam said, knowing what was on his friend's mind. For all Carl's loyalty, it was clear to Hallam that he thought Verity suffered from a fundamental misunderstanding of the whole long-term philosophy of gardening. Carl had a respect for rootedness, it probably why he had such a peculiar fixation with local history. Carl grunted and inspected the nearest plant, its leaves still pale and green, and the branches not yet grown out enough to link with its neighbor. Carl ran his hands up either side of it, ruffling the foliage with the last gesture of affection, then dug the spade into the soil. Don't come in with those dirty things on, Hallam. Leave them by the washing machine. Hallam went over to the utilities room and pulled off his shirt and jeans to reveal a spidery white body streaked with dried flake mud. He stretched the elastic on his underpants and shook a foot, causing a small piece of grit to fall out. Hoping Verity wouldn't see him, he padded barefoot to the stairs. Unfortunately, she just happened to be coming down the corridor with an armful of fabric samples. She paused to brazenly inspected his body, and he slipped. Passed on his way to the shower, he glimpsed a charitable smile that caused him to feel pitifully unqualified. Hallam helped Lucy carry her suitcases to the battered Peugeot. Verity was standing by. I'll just lever your father from his computer screen, she said cheerfully, but disappeared inside. Lucy watched her go and let out a sardonic huff. Hallam slammed the boot, and Lucy turned to him with a smile that he wanted to avoid. Come here, she gave him a long hug, to which he did not respond. It's every man for himself now. Good luck. Make sure you tap him for some cash before the term starts. It's all he's good for, and to be frank, I think it makes him feel better. Lucy paused. She inspected his face, and her smile dropped away. Don't look at me like that. I don't need this. Look at you like what? She frowned. You know exactly what you're doing. It's not fair. There's nothing I can do. I'm not asking you to do anything. Verity emerged again with Julius in tow. Lucy took a deep breath and turned towards them. She gave her father a cold look. He didn't want to meet her eyes, and instead circled the car, going over it, feigning concern about practicalities. Is everything packed? Have you checked the tire pressure? Oil? Can you see out the back? Julius, please, the car's fine. What about the windscreen wipers? Is there enough water? Dad, Lucy screamed, and suddenly stamped her foot in frustration. He looked at her, startled, and grinned bashfully. Lucy held out a hand to shake. He used it to tow her into the embrace instead. Hallam watched Verity with Julius as he crushed Lucy to his chest. Hallam counted the seconds, 1, 2, 3, until Lucy at last acknowledged defeat and wearily patted his back. Julius broke his hold. There were tears in his eyes, Hallam noted with disgust. Lucy looked at her feet and opened the door to the car. "Don't I get a kiss?" asked Verity, and stepped towards her. Bravely, she planted one on Lucy's cheek. Lucy brought the car door shut between them. "Promise you'll come and stay when you feel like it." Lucy started the engine, revving impatiently, and Verity had to raise her voice to be heard. "Call from Johannesburg when you get there. Your father's worried sick." Hallam felt a last rush of regret and dipped his head, hoping to receive one last smile from his sister, but Lucy's eyes were already beyond the gates. There was a short squirt of pebbles, and she drove away, not returning their waves. Hallam walked upstairs, pretending to fetch a plaster for the blister on his hand. Instead, he went into Lucy's room and stood there. No longer Lucy's, the striped walls, the overflowing bed. He wanted to cry, but it was not an outlet he had allowed himself access to for years. He wanted to smash up Lucy's things, but it appeared that she had got there before him. He peered into the bed and saw a small bent trophy. How could he forget her pubescent gymkhana triumph when he had cheered her on beside a now absent parrot amid the mud and sawdust, and there the stained plastic Snoopy they had given her as a childish surrogate gift 7 or 8 Christmases before. He had not bought it, but he had held wrap. Lucy had even chucked a silver napkin holder, a christening present. He could see what had happened. Lucy had swept the length of the mantelpiece, deleted the years, including him. Hallam heard the argument from the kitchen in the early evening as he returned from a tour in the lower observation points. He passed at the back door, surprised because he could plainly hear Julius's raised voice, which normally his style was to maintain surely low-volume resistance. "I don't blame her," said Verity. "What do you expect if you neglect your daughter? I can't be a father for you. She can't have thought that. I'm not sure I don't agree with you. It was as if you wanted her gone. It's not true. Is it because of who she reminds you of? What are you talking about? No. Have you really forgotten her?" "Yes, of course I have," he replied, but the tone of weary patience sounded artificial. "You're lying," she replied, indifference growing in her voice. "You still think it was our fault?" "No," his voice rose again. "My fault, then. I said no. It's as if this place is still hers. You know I can't stand it. But I've told you to make whatever changes you want within reason, and you are. Even so, I might go away for a few days." She sounded languid now, distant. "The project's about to start, you know that. Where are you going?" He breathed pause. "Please don't." Her footsteps clicked down the hall towards the stairs and then went quiet. Hallam heard an odd quiet come from the kitchen. It may have been a chair leg snagging on the slate floor. Hallam was back at gatewatch, 20 feet or so up the cedar, when he saw with his beautiful new binoculars Verity's silver BMW hiss down the drive. She slowed down at the gate and then turned hard up towards the village with a solitary blink of the indicator. He wondered if she'd seen him. Verity, he noticed, was the only person who made him wonder that.